Welcome to episode 46 of the Adam Makes Beer Industry Pro podcast. Today, I'm excited to be chatting with John Haggerty of Warped Wing Brewing. Before we get rolling, let me give a shout out to our fantastic sponsors that make content like this possible. Starting a brewery is a big step. Blickman Engineering is here to help. Since 2006, they've equipped hundreds of nano breweries for success. Their new 3.5 barrel Pro Surface electric brewing system cuts maintenance and saves at least 30 minutes per brew day with powerful under kettle heating. From 1 to 15 barrel brew houses to keg washers and grain mills, Blickman has what you need. Ready to go pro? Contact Phil or Tom at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Blickman Engineering is a proud sponsor of this channel and loves to help brewers at every stage of their journey. Tracking and managing the financial health of your brewery is a primary pillar of success. Check out my boy David Lentz at Brewed Fiscally. This man has the industry experience and skills you need so you can focus on growing your business. Bookkeeping, fractional CFO support, financial management system design, business plan review, hit up your boy. Check him out at brewedfiscally.com or shoot him an email at david@brewedfiscally.com. He is good people. John Haggerty has been involved in the brewing industry since 1993. He's held positions for various size breweries over the years, ranging from small brew pubs to large regional contract brewing companies. Currently, John is brewmaster and managing partner for Warped Wing Brewing Company in Dayton, Ohio. In his current role, he oversees all production operations. John holds his brewmaster diploma from the VLB Berlin, Germany, as well as a BFA in architecture from Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. Additionally, John has served in various roles in the Ohio Craft Brewers Association, the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, as well as founded and led the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild. Currently, John serves as chair of the advocacy committee for the Ohio Craft Brewers Association. Finally, John has had the privilege of judging many local, national, and international competitions as a recognized and qualified beer judge, including World Beer Cup, GABF, the Festival of Barrel-Aged Beer, the Copa Cerveza Mexico, the Copa Cerveza del Pacifico, and the U.S. Beer Tasting Championships, to name a few. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely,
You're about ready
man.
for you're going to be like a voiceover guy in movies and stuff here pretty soon. That was great.
Well, John, I appreciate it. So here's the deal, man. I'm always worried that a dear brewer buddy of mine did a radio spot back in Michigan, and when he got out, he went into the studio and everything, and he's talking with the radio guy, and everything's normal. And then he's like, "All right, we're gonna go live." And then the radio guy is like, "Welcome to." So I'm always wondering. I'm always concerned that you want to read it like like you're a real person that has inflection, but I always feel like it's a fine line. So I appreciate the compliment, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. New career. It's gonna be your new career.
Well, John, I appreciate you making time today. We're gonna dig into a bunch of different stuff. And for those of you that don't know, I was in at Warped Wing. I believe that was back in December, and did some stuff in there. Checked out some hot side brew day stuff. Checked out that awesome canning line that you guys have going on over there. So if you haven't checked out that, that's in the playlist that I have. I believe it's called Ultimate Brewery Tour, maybe. I'm not crazy about the name, but it's what it's called. But you got some deep dives on some cool stuff. So I was glad that you were willing to jump on and talk through things today, John. So I think, first thing, when I was reading your introduction, there's some diversity in that portfolio. So kind of what was your path into getting into professional brewing?
Well, first of all, when I was in high school, in college, it wasn't that craft beer didn't exist. I think, you go back and you look at Sierra and Bell's and some of the other stalwarts of the industry. I mean, they were starting in the mid 80s. So they were around, but man, they were not widely available. And you know, in Indiana where I grew up, and then in Southwest Ohio where I went to college, you didn't see craft beer, right? I mean, we were corn lager drinking guys, and it was great. That's all we knew, and we were perfectly content with that at the time.
What was your college beer?
It's funny. We used to drink, because we were poor college kids, we would drink Go Bell Crowd Pleasers, right? 30 cans for $5. I was just talking to some buddies of mine. They were here in the brewery over this past weekend. We were laughing about that. It was horrendous. And for those that don't know what that is, that was the Stroh's Brewing Company's like cheapo beer.
Okay.
And that's what we drank because you could get the most for the least.
Well, for me, it was in college. It was Schaefer Light.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't know. There's so yeah, we all had those cheap ones that we had back in the day. But anyways, I cut you off, John.
Well, no, that's fine. So I didn't even know what craft beer was until I graduated from college, and I decided that I was going to move to Seattle, and that was in '91. And so when I got to Seattle, of course, there's this craft beer scene that's burgeoning and starting to happen. And, you know, I did a couple of gigs around construction and some different stuff, trying to put my architectural degree to use before I finally started working at this brew pub. And that's when I really started to get into beer. And I thought to myself, if you're going to spend your time working in this kitchen at this brew pub, you might as well get paid to learn how to do something cool.
Yeah.
And so I started bugging the crap out of the guy that was head brewer. His name is Ed Tringali. Ed's actually still around. He does a lot of work in Japan and Asia now, but just bugged the daylights out of him. And eventually he had an opening in the brewery. It was just him and one part-time assistant. And so he let me take that role on. And then, Ed left, and then Dick Cantwell came in. I think a lot of folks know who Dick is. And
hell yeah.
I got to work with Dick for a couple of years there. And both those guys were great mentors. And of course, at that time in Seattle, there was a lot of other guys that were making beer, like Fal Allen and the guys over at Hales, Larry, Hall, and Kevin Forehand and Bill Jenkins. I mean, a lot of guys that were just great brewers and great people, and would share their knowledge with you. And basically they taught me how to make beer, and I've been doing it ever since. So just
how long were you? How long between you actually being hands-on in a brewery to going to Germany for the Brewmaster degree?
That was like maybe 8 years. So I got my first brewing gig in '93, and I went to Germany in 2001. So like 8.5 years, something like that. And in that time, I worked at 2 different breweries in Seattle for a while. Because, I had like 3 or 4 jobs because you had to make all the ends meet. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I worked at the Big Time Brewery, which is where I started. And I think that place is still around as far as I know. I mean, it's been a minute since I've been back to Seattle, but I think it's still there. So I worked there with Ed and Dick. And then I also worked for a while at a place called the Pacific Northwest Brewing Company. That was an open top fermentation deal.
Interesting.
That guy, the guy that's head brewer there, his name is Kim Brusco, also a really nice guy, knowledgeable guy. And, I learned a lot there, but in all due respect to Kim, the setup was not ideal. And so you learned a lot about what not to do, which sometimes is even more important than the opposite. And it was interesting, open top fermenters and so forth, which was somewhat unique. So I did that for a number of years, and then I left. I quit my job and I sold everything that I own. I took a year hiatus, and I lived out of my backpack in Asia for a year. And then when I came back, I moved to Madison, Wisconsin. So I worked at the Great Dane with Rob Labreglio, great dude, good place. And that place is still there and thriving, and they have multiple outlets now. Back at the time, we just had the original one, which is on Doty Street there in Madison. So I was there for about a year, and then these guys up in Minnesota hired me to go up to Minnesota and build a brew pub for them. And so that was the first time I got to sort of run my own show and put a project together. That was called the Minneapolis Town Hall Brewery, and that's still around. And they now have a couple of spots. And so I spent 3 years or so doing that. And then that's also when I founded the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild, because the laws in Minnesota were really restrictive in what you could do at the time. And, those guys might still feel that way that they are, but I know a few changes have been made legislatively up there. So I left there because I knew I couldn't make the kind of money I wanted to make being the head brewer at a brew pub. Mm-hmm. And I needed to start doing production work. And so I didn't have any production experience at that point. Everything had been in a brew pub. So at the time, there was I guess there were three choices. You could go to work at James Page, which was a small craft brewery that was packaging at the time in St. Paul. There was Summit, who was pretty good sized craft brewery, even bigger now. They were over in St. Paul as well. And that was probably what most people would have expected me to do. Or there was Minnesota Brewing Company, which was an old corn lager brewery that dated back before Prohibition. It shut down during Prohibition, come back. It was a Heilemann plant for a long time. It was originally a Jacob Schmidt plant. Then it was a Heilemann plant. Then it closed. And there's a whole story behind that. And then it reopened as Minnesota Brewing Company, and they were making beers like Grain Belt, Pig's Eye. They were doing a lot of contracts for, I don't know if they did Sam Adams or maybe they did Pete's. I can't remember. But we also did like Mike's Hard Lemonade, and we did a lot of different stuff. And it was really enlightening work. Because they did stuff way different than I'd ever done it before, and at massive scale, and learning how to organize stuff, to be efficient and so forth. So that was a really great experience. And I remember all the guys that used to hang out at the tap room at the brew pub that I ran in Minnesota were like, "Why the hell are you going over there?" They all thought I was going to like Summit, right? And, that probably would have been worthwhile as well, but it was a unique opportunity. I'm glad I took it. I got to do a lot of stuff. Like we were using mild steel tanks that were lined with glass, right? I mean, really, you don't see that kind of stuff anymore. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Like 400 barrel open top fermenters. Yeah. I mean, just crazy stuff. In fact, the guy that hired me there, his name was Sig Plagens. He was German, right? He was like right off the boat from Germany. So I worked under him for a while, and then he retired, and Phil Gagne, who's a great friend of mine and great brewer, took over, and he and the assistant brewmaster, Tom Clark, who's got a little place out in Pennsylvania now in Berwick, great mentors. George Brown was one of the other assistant brewmasters there. He had been the brewmaster at Wiedemann in Kentucky for a while. Mm-hmm. So just really, really good guys to work for, knowledgeable, but you could see the writing on the wall, and it was just like, this place isn't going to make it. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I decided I'd apply to go to brewing school, because I was running into a ceiling. Right, because I didn't have a formal brewing degree, but I had a lot of experience, particularly at that time. In 2000 or so, I had 7-8 years of experience working in a brewery, which was just not heard of at that point in time, particularly here in this part of the country. Mm-hmm. But I get all the way through like a hiring process to run a brewery for somebody, and I'd lose that at the end because I didn't have a brewing degree, right? Because for the hiring manager, it was safer for them. If they hired someone with a degree and then the guy didn't work out, well, how were they supposed to know better, right? But if they took a chance on me and I didn't work out, well, then that would be their fault because they took a chance, right? And so it's like, okay, I gotta go, I gotta do this. And so at the time, there was a real price advantage to go to Germany versus doing one of the programs in the United States. So I looked at what was available, which basically was Siebel, the Davis program through the extension, VLB. You could do Harriet Watt, but it was a 4-year program, which I didn't want. There was a couple others. There's a program in Leuven, but you got to speak Flemish. You could go to Weinstefan, but you got to speak German. Well, the VLB just started teaching in English, right?
Okay.
And so it's like, okay, that's good. That's where I want to go. A, it's German brewing degree, so that looks good. And then B, it was a year-long program versus like 12 or 16 weeks. I can't remember what the Siebel program was at the time, but to go to Siebel at the time, it was like $15,000 tuition. Plus you had to go live in Chicago for whatever it was, 12, 16 weeks. Well, Berlin was a fraction of the cost of living, and the tuition at the time was only $6,000. And I'm like, hey, not only is it German, but it's a bargain, right?
Yeah.
That was partly due to the fact that, in Germany, college or post-high school education is free, assuming that, you pass these various tests and so forth. That's paid for by the state. And so they weren't used to, having to charge tuition to kids as a private institute. But, the beer industry in Germany, and it still is in consolidation, it was back then. And so the number of kids that were enrolling to go to brewing school was declining. And so the VLB at the time was having a hard time getting enough people to pay tuition or to go to get money from the state to keep the doors open. And so that's why they started teaching in English, so they could get a more international student body that would pay to go to school and basically save the school.
How many Americans were in the program when you were there?
So Americans, there was only one other American, and there was about 30 kids total. There were supposed to be a couple of more. There was a couple that were in the class before me as well, which was the first class they taught in English. In fact, Scott Jennings, who runs the Sierra plant there in North Carolina, he was in the class before me. And I've gotten to know Scott a little bit because of our relationship to the VLB. But the year that I went to the program was 2001, right? And so we started in October of 2001. And if you remember, September of 2001, there was a huge terrorist attack in New York City, right? And so for the first couple of weeks after that, there were no flights at all. And so I was one of the first flights that I'm going to Germany after all that happened.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the other, I don't know how many Americans they had originally signed up to be in that course. But after all that, they all dropped. And so it was just myself and my friend, Travis Fritz. I didn't know Travis before we went to that program. But we got to know each other real well, and we've been friends ever since. Travis now runs a brewery up in Michigan called Old Nation.
Yeah.
That one. They make M43, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So he and I spent a year in Germany together, trying to answer for our fellow Americans, because everyone would be like, "Hey, dude, what's going on?" You're like, "Hey, I'm just here to learn how to make beer."
So, how is that? Because a year is, I'm assuming the program was relatively condensed. You know what I mean? How would you assess like your growth as a brewing professional from the beginning of that to the end of it?
Of the program at the VLB?
Yeah, of like the program, or like what you came away with after going through that program. What were you better prepared for?
Well, I think it's a tough question because I had quite a bit of experience before I went, and I would recommend that anybody that is thinking about going to brewing school go work in a professional brewery for, a year or two at least. I don't know that you need to do what I did where you worked, 8 or 9 years or a decade or something and then go. That's probably excessive. But at least a couple of years, because it helps. There is a vernacular, there's a language in the brewery that, a lot of non-common items that we use in the brewery and terminology that we use in the brewery. And if you know what it means before you get there, it just helps.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Were you a metric guy before going over there?
No. No, dude, I'm a red-blooded American, man. Come on.
Well, there's your language barrier right there.
Yeah. Well, it was great. So, by the end, I could convert back and forth in my head, no problem, on demand. I can't do that anymore because I didn't bring metric back with me and make everybody use it. I went back to imperial units, but it was cool, so as part of our class, our German teachers and professors and grad students that were teaching us and so forth, because the VLB, the program I was in was a 1-year program. Now they run a condensed version of that, which is like 6 months. But they also had a 4-year program, which, if you were a German speaker, you could go through that. And it was more of like a food science program with focus in brewing, right? And then they had a 6-year program, which was a brewery engineering program. And then they had an 8-year program, which was brewing PhD, right? And so you were in the classroom setting with all these people that are on these different tracks. And so some of those people are teaching some of your practical courses, like your micro lab or your chemistry lab or whatever, or some of the engineering and math and so forth. So you got to know all these people and you got to be friends with people in these different programs, which was really interesting. So anyway, so they would teach you some of the German terminology for the stuff we were talking about in the brewery, right? And so when we would have breaks, and one of the things I really appreciated about the way the program was set up at the time was because we had 2 weeks off at Christmas. We had a week off in the winter. We had 2 weeks off over the spring, just like they did with the university, right? And so some people would go back to where they were from, right? Because there was kids from all over Europe. And I mean, they shouldn't say kids either. I mean, they were adults. They were 25, 30 years old. But South America, Europe, a couple people from like the Faroe Islands and just different places, right? People from all over. So a lot of those people would go back to wherever they were from, and we had time off. And I was like, I'm not spending the money to do that. I'm here. I'm going to do something here. And so I would ask the program to like set me up with an internship, and I would go work in a brewery or go work in a malt plant in some other part of Germany for a week or two, which was great because I get to go see some other part of Germany. But then I was also hanging out with regular people working in a plant, and it was funny because by the time I got to spring break, I knew enough German, technical German, that we could speak about like the malting process in German. But if they were to ask me, like, what'd you do this weekend? Or doesn't this weather suck? I couldn't do it. Right. So it made some really weird interactions. Because they're like, how do you know how to talk about the kiln and you don't know how to talk about what the weather's like? You know what I mean? But that's how it went. Right. And that was just part of the deal because we were in these classes with these guys and that's what they were teaching us.
Sure.
Yeah. So it was great. Well, so I didn't really answer your question, I think, entirely, but how did it prepare me as a brewer? I think the thing that was interesting about it was that a lot of the other people in the course were trying to keep up with the basic theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I already had most of the basic theory down because I had some really good teachers in my past when I worked at these different breweries, like I mentioned. And so I already had that stuff. So it allowed me to pay attention to some of the other, you know, minute details that sometimes get overlooked, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if you're having a gushing problem in your beer, sometimes that can be caused by calcium deficiencies. And how does that work? Or if you miss your diacetyl rest on your beer, the way to fix it is to make another batch of beer and krausen it and use that krausen to get the temperature up. And you can mitigate that missed diacetyl rest, which, you know, is still a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
But saves the batch of beer, right?
Yep.
So, you know, just stuff like that you learn that's a little bit more, you know, sort of obscure info that's out there that you got to kind of dig in. So allow me to focus on some of that stuff more, which I think in the end is a benefit, right? Because at the end of the day, your formal brewing education, a guy with a formal brewing education doesn't necessarily make better beer than a guy without it, right?
Mm-hmm. So
it just allows you to troubleshoot, right? Like if I'm having a problem, now I have some reference material and places to start to go solve the problem.
Yeah. So if you had to talk about, and you've used this term in talking about, you know, you work with different great brewers, different things like that. What do you think the components of, you know, a great brewer is? What is a great brewer bringing to the table in your mind?
So my friend Fal used to tell me this, right? When I lived in Seattle, he'd be, John, you know, he's doing his little Yoda moment. Like, he's like, John, right? The best thing you can do is make great beer all the time. The next best thing you can do is make shitty beer all the time. And the worst thing you can do is make great beer sometimes and shitty beer sometimes. Then people don't know what to expect, right?
Yeah.
And it's true, right? And so, like, when we were talking sort of in anticipation of this podcast, one of the things I mentioned was like SOPs and process are really a big deal, I think, to me, and I think just in general, because you can't have consistency if everybody on the team is doing it a different way, right? And so consistency is first and foremost the most important thing coming out of a brewery. That's what, you know, at least according to Fal and his advice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you want to do things consistently, and then ideally you want to do them consistently at a very high level, right? Mm-hmm. And so as you develop processes that work, it's like, okay, I want to do that more and continue to do that more, and then I got to go and teach that to the guys on my team. You know, if you're working in a brew pub, that might not be that big a deal. It's you and maybe one other guy. Maybe that other guy is only part-time and doesn't even run all the processes, only runs part of the processes. Mm-hmm. So in a scenario like that, you might not have to write anything down because the communication lines are pretty simple. Person A, person B, right? Mm-hmm. But you start getting into a team of where you have 5-10 people working in the group, and particularly if it's divided across shifts, you might not get to see everybody every day. And so now we've got to have some written protocols and expectations. And, you know, so when you go out on the floor, it's like, okay, we're having a problem. I go on the floor and I find, you know, team member D is, you know, not doing the thing correctly. It's like, why are you doing it this way? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I didn't know. And it's like, well, really? I have this written SOP here that you said that you read and you signed and dated at the bottom. So I don't know, it doesn't fly because it says it right here. This is how you're supposed to do it, right? Well, so, you know, that only has to happen once for somebody to be like, oh shit, I better do this the right way.
Sure. And also from a, like, I believe that a big part of helping people feel, I don't know, people enjoying working for you is that they understand their expectations, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I have some brewing friends where they go from one job to another. They go to the new place and there's 5 people on the floor. All 5 people do something in a different way.
Yep.
Quite frankly, some of them are doing things in a way that won't work. You know what I mean? It's not just that there's a little something different here, there, the other thing, like using fundamentally the wrong temperatures on chemicals.
Yeah.
With blending chemicals and whatnot. You know, that stuff is a big deal. And I think you hit it right on the head. I think so many of us that come in and have that pub experience, right? We know what we do and we update things as we learn new things and whatnot. But it's when you have to start multiplying yourself, you know, when you have to have those other people in there, you have to have those frameworks in place. It's a really, really big deal.
It is a big deal. And frankly, and look, I'm not perfect. I'm not going to sit here and say that we've never had that sort of thing happen on my team currently or on any of the teams that I've run in the past. I mean, we certainly have, but we try to mitigate it and we try to coach it out. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the really challenging things, and, you know, I got to be in charge of a brewery and in charge of a team. And then I went back and worked for someone else as a member of a team, and then, you know, back to being in charge of a team again. And one of the things that really struck me, you know, when I went back to being a member on a team as opposed to the leader of the team, right, was that you have to get over yourself, right? Even if you think what the leader of the team wants you to do is wrong, if that's what they want you to do, you do it. I mean, unless it's going to cause an injury to you or somebody else or something, right?
Certainly.
I mean, that's the way it has to be, because at the end of the day, and that's what I tell the guys on my team as well. At the end of the day, if my business partners and my investors aren't happy with the beer that is coming out of this brewery, it's not my shift guys that are going to get fired. It's me, right? So I have to answer for that. So I have to know what's going on everywhere. Conversely, if I'm one of the shift guys, I'm not the one that's going to get fired. The boss is, right? If the quality of the beer isn't any good. And so if that's what he wants, then that's what you do. I remember one time I'm not going to tell you the guy's name that did this, but
sure.
But when I was working at Minnesota Brewing Company, right? So that was after I'd run some breweries for people. And now I'm just back on the team. And one of the brewmasters, George Brown, the guy that ran the Wiedemann plant, came, and I was training a guy to do a particular job. And he came to me and he says, "Hey, John, we're having a problem with X, Y, and Z. Can you make sure that you do this, and this, whatever it was?" And the guy that I'm training had come out of another brewery that come and join our team as well. And he's like, "Well, you know, George, that's not really right because of blah, 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 blah." He did it not only in front of me, but in front of a bunch of other guys on the floor. And George just, you know, I can see him. He's just like, "Oh my God," right? Like he's about to blow a gasket. And I was like, "George, don't worry about it. We'll do it." And he's like, "Okay, thank you." He walks away. And I turn and look at this guy and I'm like, "You don't want to work here very long, do you?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "What you just did, that's fine. You go do it in the office. You know, if you're going to challenge his knowledge, you do it in the office where no one else can see it, right? Otherwise, you say, 'Yes, sir,' and you do it because he's the boss.
Sure.
Right? That's it. That's the way it works. That's not going to fly." And of course, like a week later, they fired him because they're like, it had been happening all over the place.
Yeah.
You know, you just can't do that. And, you know, I get that happens. You'll get guys that come in your plant that they think they know everything and they want to change everything you do. And I get it. You know, I'm happy to have the conversations, right? That's what I tell everybody, because I hope that everybody on my team is going out and reading stuff and listening to podcasts like yours, learning what they can wherever they learn it from. And then they bring it back because I don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. And it's like, okay, well, let's have a conversation about it. And then we make a decision as a team. And ultimately, it's up to me to decide, well, we're going to do this or not. And sometimes I might decide, we're not going to do it because I don't want to. There may not be a good reason, but there may not be a good reason to change either. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's better. It just means it's different, right? So whatever is decided, and that's what we're going to do. And you have to be able to walk out of the office and be like, okay, that's fine. Right now, sometimes they come and there's very legitimate reasons why we should change something. And it's like, okay, that's a good idea. Let's do it. But now we got to go talk to everybody. And we get everybody doing it the same way, the new way. Right. And you update the SOP and here we go. Right.
Yep.
So it has to be that way. So sometimes you get these guys that come in, they worked at someone else's plant and they want to tell you how to do it. And you're like, no, we're not going to do it that way. And then they get upset and then they go and do it that way anyways. Then you got to go fire them.
Sure.
And it's
so, you mentioned something before that I think is interesting because I do think there's an element of our industry. What is it? When I got into the industry, one of the things that I heard is that the industry is 99% asshole free. Maybe. But anyway,
it depends on how you define asshole, right? I think depending on how you define it, I might be the king of all of them.
But the flip side is I do think that sometimes we might not talk enough about how people have their egos and people have their egos in this industry as well. You know what I mean? And you talked about before being in a leadership position and then being in a worker position and then back in leadership. So after that situation of going between all both of those things, when you went back into a leadership position, do you think that you approached anything differently or saw anything differently once you had that coin flip a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And look, so this is a by the way, right? So after I came out of brewing school, I went and worked at New Holland and I ran the New Holland team for 10 years.
Yep. That's where I first became aware of you because we're both, Michigan guys, what I mean? Right. So yeah.
And so I did that and then I left and I did tanks for a year and then I ended up here at Warped Wing, right? And I only mention it because, when I got that job running the New Holland Brewing Company, that was in 2002. So I was like 33 years old. And I'm running this brewery. And granted, when I got the job, we were only doing 1,800 barrels of beer a year, which, not to say only, I mean, that's a fair amount of beer.
Sure.
But we grew it up. I mean, when I left, we were doing somewhere around 25,000, something like that. And I don't know what they're doing now, 50, maybe more. I have no idea. But the point being is I was a pretty young guy. At the time, I didn't realize how young I was, right? And so I did stuff as a leader there that I think probably didn't really help me as a leader and didn't really elicit the sort of responses that I wanted from my team. Now, being 56 years old and having done it for a while, it's like, okay, there's better ways to do this, right? So you're constantly learning stuff. I don't care what the title is that you're carrying with you, really, or even how old you are. You're constantly learning stuff, particularly when it comes to managing people. One of the things that I've had to learn the hard way is that, as a leader, it is up to me to change the way I communicate to fit my employees, not the other way around. That took me a while to figure out. And the bigger your team gets, the more you realize that, which is why I'm really happy I don't have to manage the tap rooms, because there's just a ton of people that work in the tap room.
That's a whole nother animal, man. If somebody were to say to me, hey, Adam, what's the number one reason you don't want to be operating your own place? That would be, just the idea of managing a restaurant. Managing a restaurant and the people that go along with it. That's no that's no insult to folks that are working in the
No,
restaurant.
it's hard.
It's a lot to handle, man.
It's a lot, man.
It's a lot to
handle. A lot of
handle.
personality types in the tap room.
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm really glad you said that, because first of all, it's not an easy thing to do. I can think back. I mean, I'll be real. One of my favorite sayings is, I'm not sure who it's attached to or whatever, but the graveyard is full of unreplaceable people, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, I have no problem saying that there were times in various stages of my career where I thought, well, this isn't going to work without me. And time shows you that you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it is one of those things, man, that we do have to, and for me personally, when I've learned those lessons, it's never come like in a meritorious fashion. It's never like I've just just grown. But generally what it is I've had my teeth kicked in a few times on something, and that's where the learning comes from.
Always.
So,
that's the way it works. If you don't experience some pain, you don't learn the lesson.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's very, very true. Very, very true. So I was really excited to hear you say that, because I do think it's such a big part of the puzzle. And we had chatted before when I was over there, and I do think you've got to have that constant improvement model in your head, whether it be as a leader, communicator, brewer. All those things come into play. So yeah, definitely. So chatting about SOPs, what are some of the specific things? And I know this is going to be this is a tough one, because there's a very, very long list. But you've been around the block, you've seen different things. What are some of the things that you see or have experienced people do that it's low-hanging fruit as far as cleaning up your some of your SOP practices?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, you write an SOP for every process that you run, or you should, right? So whether it's something that has many steps, like, hey, this is how we make a batch of beer, or if it's something that only has a few steps, like, here's how you clean a tank. They all have a process that you want your team to follow, and so that needs to be written down. I think, in fact, I've been helping our kitchens and a little bit of our staff write some SOPs for themselves, because I can see, they're mine to manage. I don't want to, my partner Nick and I, it's up to us to make sure everything gets done right. So I don't want to act like I'm totally washing my hands at the tap room, because I'm not. But I've also got people we've hired to manage those things. And so it's like, look, you guys, part of your problem that you're having is that you haven't written the process down that you want these guys to follow, right? And so depending on who has been scheduled, they do it slightly different, and you get different results. You get different results in terms of quality. You get different results in terms of service. You get different results in, so on and so forth. So let's go through and let's write some of this down. Well, how do you write one? Right? I mean, that's usually the thing that hangs most people up from writing them, because they don't know how to do it. Right? But the reality is there's nothing to it. Right? You're just writing down what you do. Right? So the easy way to do it for some people is to walk around with like some kind of voice recorder through the course of your day. Like, you're going to go run the brew house. Okay, got my voice recorder. And as I'm doing stuff, I'm talking into this thing. And so then I can just go back and translate it onto a written page. Right. So, and that certainly works. Other times, like the way I do it is I just go out and pretend like I'm doing it, and then I write it down, and I write it as I go.
Yes.
Now, the trick is to know if you've written a good SOP or not. right, is does it accomplish what it is you set out to do, right? Which really in the end is I got to get everybody to do it this way. So it's a training document, right? So can I go to somebody that's never done this and get them to read this and see if they could follow it through beginning to end, adequately? And so that's always the tests that I give to all of them. And if the person doesn't know, like, hey, what's this valve? Like a lot of times you got to go through, you got to number, letter your valves so that everyone knows which one you're talking about. Or, you got like, we have these quick disconnects that we use to connect gas lines to tanks or whatever. What's that called? Right. Well, we call it the Schwingel dingle, right? Which is a term that came from New Holland. So my guys at New Holland, that's what they started calling it. And so I
thought you got that one from when you were in Germany. That sounds very official.
Yeah, it does. And so that's what we call those things. And so how would anybody that's never worked in our brewery know what that is, right? And so it's like, oh, I got to have a photo of that. This is what this looks like, and this is where you find it, right? So someone can be reading the SOP and go, oh yeah, okay, now I got to go attach the Schwingel dingle, and look, it's over on the park car. Okay, go over there. Oh, there it is, right? And this is what it looks like. And so you just go through and you do it. I mean, it's really base level stuff. It's nothing that you need any sort of advanced degree or anything to do. You just got to want to do it, right?
I do like the fact that, and I think that it is really key, because even if you're not doing the process when you're creating it, like if you're going down and like mock cleaning a tank, and I found that when I've written SOPs in the past, I write out, I'll do it from home. I'll sit there and I'll work on it from home. I'll make my list, and then I can give it to, like when I was at Cartridge, I had two folks working with me, and then I could just give it to them and say, listen, I know there's holes in here.
Yeah.
What are we missing here? And he's like, here. You know what I mean? It's one of those things. So I think actually doing it and writing it, or mock doing that task and writing those things out, is a very thorough way to do it. That's a good way to close gaps in those SOPs.
Yeah, that's right. Because I can tell you right now, your first draft is, to your point, is going to have gaps in it.
It's a living document.
Probably your second and third one will too.
Yeah.
Actually, you're going to have to go through and edit it a few times. Go back. There's always little details that you forget. And like I'm fond of saying, God is in the details. That means, that was a Frank Lloyd Wright saying, and anybody that's worked for me heard me say that, because any idiot can put up 4 walls and put a roof on it and call it a house. But if you want to be godlike, you want to be great at what you do, you got to pay attention to those little details. They're the things that make the difference between okay and bad, or okay and great, right? So that all counts. So you got to make sure you capture all those little things. And so that's why it usually takes a few times going through it, combing through it, doing it, showing it to your team, letting them provide feedback on it, showing it to somebody that's never done it before, letting them say, hey, I don't understand what this means. How would anyone know what this means?
Sure.
And you go through and do that a few times and make the edits after each time. After, 3, 4, 5 times, you've probably got it pretty good.
For sure. Let's take a swing over and start chatting about, you had mentioned that you're doing some work with advanced hop products. And I think that's interesting. What can you tell us about some of the stuff, whether it be products, types of products that you're using, how you're testing them out? What do you have going on there, John?
Well, so some of this stuff has been around for a couple of years, and we've just started dabbling in it because, like a lot of people, we were long on our hop contracts coming out of 2018. The whole industry sort of had this plateau and slowdown, and then of course the pandemic impacted everybody, and so we've been long on our hop contracts for a few years. So I've been a little bit reluctant to get into some of this stuff for the last few years, because I need to make sure that we're using all the plant material that we had contracted out. So now that we're sort of coming back into balance here, it's given us the freedom to start playing around with some stuff, which I think's been really interesting. So we started off playing around with some stuff from Steiner called Salvo. They didn't always call it that. When they first came out with it, it's called Beta AE, and it's like a beta that stood for beta aroma extract. And so that's a CO2 extract, and we use that in the whirlpool, and we also do some, well, what I call a modified hop dip, right? So the whirlpool, that's pretty straightforward. People know what that is. Hop dip, maybe some people know what that is, but traditionally, well, quote unquote, traditionally, hop dip, you would pump your wort into your fermenter, maybe a little bit warm, and add this hop material, this Salvo stuff or some similar type product, and you'd let it sit for 45 minutes or an hour, do whatever it does, and at a cooler temperature, right? 150, 160, whatever. And then you would knock the rest of the wort in cold to bring that temperature down to a fermentation temperature, add your yeast and so on and so forth. And I thought, man, that's just a pain in the ass. That sounds like I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So we have a smaller kettle. It's maybe 60 gallons. So our brew house is 30 barrels, by the way. So it's maybe like a 2-barrel tank. And when we knock out to the whirlpool, we will side stream, barrel and a half of liquid or whatever over into that side tank, and then we'll do the hop dipping there, right? Because it doesn't have the thermal mass, so it'll cool off. So we'll add the Salvo there, and then when we go back to knock out from the whirlpool, we can let it blend in on the way to the heat exchanger and then get cooled off immediately and then pitch the yeast in. So that works better for us, just from a functionality standpoint.
Is Salvo one that is a bitterness contributor? I can't remember because there's a couple of different products.
Yeah, it'll contribute a little bit, but it's mostly flavor, right? In some aroma. Yeah. And then, so we've been doing that, and I've been really happy with what that contributes. And so now what
have you seen in the finished beer utilizing that technique? Have you done it with like a standard beer and you've trialed it like that, or is it only one-offs that you've used that technique with?
No, we do that in our Gamma Bomb, which is our regular IPA. We didn't always do that, but we've been doing that for maybe the last 2 years.
Okay.
But then recently, maybe 6 months ago, we started doing that hop dipping technique as well. So that was a new change. And then they sell that stuff by varietal. Now, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that you can identify the varieties. They probably don't want me to say that, but I will say that the varieties tend to lean towards the flavor profiles that are associated with those varieties, right?
Yeah.
So if you have something that's sort of that you think of as citrusy, it's going to give you sort of a citrus, but it isn't necessarily going to be a varietal specific citrus, in my opinion. If you get something that's sort of piney, you'll get that. And so we now do sort of a blend of a couple of different Salvos varieties, and you'd have to go onto the Steiner website and see everything that they got. There's a ton of them. So we've been doing that. We've been doing some stuff with Terpenes, which has been.
So actually, if I could pause you just real quick, I have one question to see what your experience with it has been. Is talking about some of those flowable like Salvo type products. Do you find that you'd like to blend products like that with a pellet as well?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're using a blend with that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We don't do anything well, at least not yet. I'll probably contradict myself here later, depending on what the conversation goes. But everything is sort of a blend, right?
Sure.
So there are compounds in hop pellets that you want
Mhm.
that aren't in some of the other, processed hop products, right?
Mhm.
So you don't want to get rid of pellets necessarily entirely, although I know there are people that have done that.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, I guess it comes down to what you want as an outcome. But for us, with our regular IPA, that's not what we were trying to do. Right? What we're trying to do is, does this make the beer taste better? A,
Yes.
and B, can we use some of this stuff to help improve yield and so
Mhm.
forth? Because all this plant material
Sure.
adds up to a lot of loss in the tanks, and so if we can increase our yield, even a couple percentage points, it adds up over the course
Certainly.
of the year. So we do both pellets and these different hop products. So we started doing terpenes a few years ago. It actually started off by we were doing a beer. We do a beer for 420, which I'm
Mhm.
going to assume your listeners know what that's about.
Yeah, indeed.
Of course, you have to make it smell and taste like weed
Sure.
without actually using weed in it.
Sure.
And so we found a group called Abstracts. They're out of California, and they make these terpene extracts. At the time when we started, they were just doing terpenes that tasted like marijuana strains.
Mhm.
And so that was great. That's what we wanted for this particular beer. But then shortly thereafter, after we started doing that, they started doing hop terpene extractions. And so those are by variety. And so that's like all aroma, right?
Mhm.
And so we have started to blend some of that into our IPA as well. Our IPA's, dry hop is Centennial Cascade Amarillo, but then we got these different varieties of Salvo in there, and we've got some of this abstract terpene in underneath there as well, just to sort of punch up a little more citrus note in it, which I think works really well.
What portion of the process is that used? And whenever I hear about these different compounds, because I'll one of my weakest areas, I feel, there's those folks that they know every hop compound and what it does along every level. I in general, I'm not that guy. So I'm always interested when I hear about these new products. It's like, okay, how are we getting those things into solution? Are they going on the hot side, cold side? What
No,
needs to be done to make that thing
these terpene
work?
cold side additions.
Mm.
They're water soluble, so that you just pour them right in. It's easy. It's easier than dry hopping.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take a lot either. And again, it depends on what the outcome is you're looking for. If you're going to replace all of your dry hops, then you're going to need to use more. Obviously, we were using this in this particular instance as a supplementary aromatic compound to what we were already doing. So it's not a ton of it into the tank, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's enough to make an aromatic difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's easy to use, easy to add. We keep it in the cold box. Lasts, no problem, right?
Yeah. So also are there benefits to a shelf stability standpoint, not just storing the product itself, but for the beer on store shelves? Are there any benefits of like extended shelf life or no?
Well, I don't know that. I couldn't say categorically, but I doubt it, right? Because what you're really talking about when you're talking about shelf stability on a store shelf, you're really talking about the reactions around oxygen, right? When you look at your time, temperature, motion, light, and oxygen, right? Those are really the 5 enemies of packaged beer, right? Other than sunlight, the other 3 and oxygen work together, right? Because these other 3, time, temperature, motion, all have to do with the rate of oxygen reaction in the beer, right? Once you've eaten all the oxygen up, then you're in a hermetically sealed container. I mean, that's it, right? What's going to happen? So, which is why if you can get the container filled without any oxygen, you're in pretty good shape, right? That's what's then your shelf life the most. So these hops, I don't think they don't do anything like that to ward off the effects of oxygen. I do think that, and I haven't done any tests on this, so I can't say this categorically, but my organoleptic perception, or my eyesight, just watching the beer performing the glass, is that I think there's some foam positive stuff going on with some of these, right? Because it seems like the foam on the IPAs changed for the better a little bit since we've started using some of this stuff, right?
Have you played with like a Tetra type product as well?
Yeah, we use Tetra also. We use Tetra in most of our lager beers. Any light beer, really, you need to use it because protein content's so low. There's not enough foam stability in there. Particularly for us, we're American brewers. Yep. As American brewers, we have this sort of messed up combination of German and English traditions, right? So, like a lot of guys in the U.S., we're running an English sort of brew house on making German style beer. So we do a single temperature fusion mash, and you get what you get. Yeah. If you can do a step mash, then I think you can really have a net positive impact on your foam stability. It's obvious. Now, is that the best use of your dollars to build a brew house that can do that when you can just take some Tetra and add it to your recipe and get the same impact, right? Yeah. Now I would say that you got to be careful, right? It's not, more isn't always better.
What's the end result of too much in your experience with Tetra?
Well, the foam gets kind of soapy. I mean, it's big. It won't collapse at all. And then it creates sort of a harsh finish in the beer also. So in my mind, because Tetra will add bitterness. Yes. So you want to add some, enough so that you can really just barely perceive the change in bitterness when you're drinking it. And if you're there, you're probably at the right point. You're going to get some really nice foam stability, and you really haven't impacted the flavor of the beer enough that most people are going to notice. And
I've always been such a big fan of that product especially from I know every brewer has, a different voice, right? The way they like to build beers and whatnot. For me personally, I like to try to make beers that have, bold flavor and aromas and everything like that. But I try to be very, very cognizant of balance. Yep. And for me personally, my palate, and I know this from, tasting beers with my brewer friends over the years, me personally, I'm like one notch lower preference wise than some other folks that I drank beers with, And so for me personally, I would rather, I like being able to build a recipe because I like to tend to be a little bit softer on the bitterness, but having a product like Tetra in house, it's nice knowing that, hey, if I went a little too soft, I can also nudge it up on the back end. So it actually gives some nice flexibility from a recipe creation standpoint too, because me personally, so like I remember when I would come up and drink Sierra Nevada was it's more bitter than what I typically like, right? And that might be some sacrilege for different people, but we were both drinking beers in Michigan, and I remember, late or mid 2000s, you could get Huma from Shorts, and that beer was bitter as hell. And that beer was part of kind of that whole, a little bit of the IBU race, but people like the boldness. And so I know that's not my palate, right? So having that tool that gives you some flexibility on the back end, I think is really valuable, because as you say, you definitely will pull bitterness off of it, for sure. For sure. And you get the benefit of the additional foam stability. But I have seen, like you mentioned, when you try to push that too far, I think the quality of that bitterness can get a little bit unappealing for me.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I think it's interesting too, like when you talk about IPAs in particular, like the one from Shorts, Huma. I don't know that Tetra works in that. I mean, it works as an additive for your foam stability, but when you're talking about these really super hopped up beers, there's bitterness qualities, that different varieties have. Like a bitterness from a German Magnum is different than bitterness from, say, Bravo, which is different than bitterness from Chinook, which is, so on and so forth. So, the Tetra, I mean, when you use it in the right amount, in my opinion, the right amount, it tends to be more of a refined bitterness, more like Magnum, in my opinion, than it does to be like Chinook or something, right? So if you're making an IPA, as an example, you're still going to want to use, if you want that super intense bitterness, you're still going to want to use a prodigious amount of something like that, right? To your point, it's more of a fine tuning, right? So.
Yeah, that's really where I found, some utility with that, and I think it's a good one to be able to use in that way. So, we were talking before about some of the advanced hop products that you've been playing with over time, and you had mentioned we're essentially in a lot of these cases removing green matter from the equation increasingly, right?
Yep.
When what's your thought when you remove that green matter completely? Because I know some people have done some stuff that's all extract, all advanced hop product, things like that. What's your experience been with maybe doing things in that direction, or what do you think the pellets help to do for the beer itself?
Yeah, I think there's a mouthfeel that you get out of some of that. Now, I have to be clear. We haven't made an all extract or advanced hop product beer yet. I mean, I'm sure that we will, because it seems like an obvious thing to do, right? On our pilot system at some point, just to see what's the outcome of that. And in fact, I know, like when you make an NA beer, you in the kettle, you can use pellets, and that's fine. But when you get to, like, if you're going to do any dry hopping or anything on the cold side, you really need to use all extracts, because you don't want any of the enzymes from the plant material that potentially create a hop creep scenario in your NA beer, right? So, we're starting to play around with some of that, and so those are going to be more extract driven. And so, how does that compare to regular beer is all extract driven? I don't know yet. This answer is still to come.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right. There are guys doing that. I think it's legitimate. I don't think that there's any reason to not do that. Hold on, my phone's about to die. I got to plug in.
You're fine.
But I don't know that I would set out to do that intentionally right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're good. And sometimes
product. I would
sure.
I would do it with a test, right? But I don't know how I would do it with an established product.
I know that sometimes when people have talked about doing it with hazy, and I've tasted some beers that have kind of been built in a similar way. I do think that green matter does add to some level of the balance, whether it's a polyphenol thing or what have you. I do think there's some structure, and I have heard people talk about the beers can become, you know, a little flabby, right? Like it's kind of a structural thing. So, but yeah, I think it's interesting, and we're not going to stop seeing new hot products coming out. That's just going to keep rolling.
Yeah, and in fact, we just started doing some stuff with Yakima Chief Hyper Boost, which is interesting. That's also varietal specific, cold side, and I think most interesting, we're starting to run some tests with a product from Lallemand called YOPS, YOPS.
Okay.
Familiar with this?
I am not, no.
They are extracting terpenes from yeast, thus the Y, that can then be put back together and give hop-like flavors. And so we've sampled a couple. We're getting ready to do a test brew with a couple of these blended together. They present it as very citrusy in the glass. It was very interesting result. Again, not varietal specific, but you know, citrus forward in the kind of result that you want to get from a hop. And so, you know, according to them, they're doing it as an initiative to it's like a conservation initiative. If you don't have to grow the plants to get the same flavor, then you don't have to use the water. You don't have to use the arable land to grow the plants. You can grow other crops, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
It's very interesting stuff.
Well, and one of the things that I like about what you're talking about is you're talking about layering these things too. And one, I think it's the smartest way as you're experimenting, because, you know, in a situation like you're in where you have packaged brands, right? It helps to layer things in, but you know, a lot of the research that I've done and work that I've done with that stuff is I think sometimes we feel like, and I think the hop industry in and of itself is always looking for the next Citra, the next Mosaic, something that's a little bit of a cheat code on whatever side of it, right? Yep. And the more you see new products, new yeasts, you know, all these different things come and go. I think big picture, what it's really about is it's about you know, it's one more thing added to your tool belt that you have access to, right? And it's about I think it's probably a little bit more about being skillful with those things than, you know, treating everything like a sledgehammer, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you ought to be working towards not being a sledgehammer anyways, but
yeah, right.
But I think in terms of like, you know, blending and layering and doing those sorts of things with these different materials, for me, it's a safety position also, right? Because hypothetically, you know, let's say we're blending 3 or 4 different hops into our IPA, and then we got a couple of these different advanced hop products in there also. And then one year there's a crop failure, and so you can't get as much of hop A that you want. So, okay, I'm going to decrease that. I can pick up some of the pellet content on the other ones, and I can add a little bit more of one of these advanced products, and I can get this thing to taste more or less the same with a slightly different mix of hop material, because all of a sudden I had a unforeseeable shortage due to some agronomics thing. You know what I mean? Sure. That stuff happens all the time. You know, I think for some of the people listening, they'll probably forget about what happened in 2007 with the hop crop, right? I mean, you basically for the first 17 years, 15 years of my career, you could get hops, no problem. Right. And then 2017, you couldn't get them at all, you know, and then for about 10 years, everything was contracted. And now it's all swung the opposite way. and it happened really fast, right? And what was happening, people were over contracting their hops because they knew they could turn around and sell them on the secondary market. And so for them, and the way the growth curves were going for breweries in the late 2000s and early teens, it was safer to have extra, particularly if you knew you could move them if you had to. Well, then when the market fell out in 2018, everybody was stuck with these hops, right? So I think that, I know from talking to my hop vendors, there are breweries they won't do business with anymore because they just walked away from their contracts.
Sure.
Right? And it's like, I couldn't do that. I agreed to buy him. I'm going to him now. I might need a little extra time, but I'm going to do it. Right.
Yeah.
People did that all the time. Right. And so now we've been in a surplus market really since 2018. But, if you listen to your hop vendors, they're telling you it's coming. All right. 2-3 years down the road, there's going to be another shortage. That's not just, hyperbole. They're not just saying that to try to get you to sign agreements. They're saying it because that's the history of the hop industry. About every, between 10 and 20 years, so maybe every 15 years on average, the whole thing flips. And it's this boom and bust cycle on supply and demand. And it's just, it just has always done that. And don't ask me why they can't get it figured out, or why we as brewers can't get it figured out, but we can't. So that's the way it goes. Yeah, for
sure. Well, let me ask you a question, because I wanna respect your time, and I think I've got like 10 or 15 minutes, and I do want to dip into, if you're interested in talking a little bit more about some of the NA stuff that you might have going on. Do you feel like we could do that in about 10 minutes ish?
Maybe. We'll see, I guess.
Okay, well let's start digging. Tell me what you got going on, John.
Well, I think like a lot of people are interested in a beer because it's growing. As a segment, it's growing exponentially. For us, our interest, I don't know if we're interested necessarily in putting it out into the wholesale market. We'll see. But I think I am interested in making it for my own tap rooms. If I can make my own versus buying somebody else's, then that represents a fair amount of income for me, just on the difference in cost of goods, right? What it costs me to make beer versus what it costs me to buy it. So that's really where our interest is stemming from, at least initially. And then B, for me, it's sort of a technical challenge. Can I pull this off and make something that tastes good? I mean, that's the essence of what we do. And the answer right now is I don't know. If I can do it, we'll find out. So we've run an initial test on our pilot system, making NA beer. That seemed to go pretty well. We're using a special yeast, so it can't really ferment. So it's not going to be 0% alcohol. It's going to target is 0.5 or less. So we made really low gravity wort. It was like 7.5 p. And no, not even, excuse me, that's the light lager. It was 4.5 p.
Okay.
And then it fermented down to like 3.8. Right. So I think we're good. And then that was it. Right. We had to really pay close attention to the pH in the mash, in the kettle, and then when we knocked out into the fermenter. And then you got to get your terminal pH to be below 4. Is really critical.
What do you feel like is kind of, and I know this is going to be different based on different things, but if there was a floor for what you've been experimenting with, and how are you adjusting that pH? Are we talking like phosphoric or lactic additions, things like that?
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
So we mash in with some acidulated malt also. But you got to kettle correct. You can't get the pH that you need to have in your mash. Just it ain't going to work if you do it all in the mash, right?
Mhm.
So you gotta use mineral acids, and we use a blend of phos and lactic to do that. We've also got access to citric, so we might try that also.
Sure.
And then the trick with beer, it's like soda. We make soda also, and and we don't have a pasteurizer, right? This is what this is all driving towards. Sure. So with soda, soda is pretty acidic, and then you also adding chemical stabilizers to it, and so that combination of the acidity and the chemical stabilizers make it shelf stable. But beer's not as acidic, right? I mean, regular beer, it's like 4.5 pH, which is not going to be microbiologically stable. But we've got alcohol, we've got hops, and so that sort of counteracts that. So because we don't have alcohol now, you still got hops potentially, depending on what you're doing, but you don't have alcohol. So you got to get the pH down below 4 to have a shot at making it microbiologically stable. And then what we're going to do, what we do have, which is a little bit unique, is we have a warming table because I have a limited amount of cold storage. And so I have to warm up all the canned beer. When we're running canned beer, I got to warm it up to the dew point so it stops condensating on the can, so that it doesn't, when you put the PacTech ring on it, it doesn't trap the moisture on the top of the can and then grow into mold and stuff. So we have this warming table. And so what we're going to do, at least as a test, is the test run on the pilot system and for our tap rooms, is I'm going to use the warming table as like a pasteurization bath, right? So because it's a shower with a conveyor that runs through it. So we're going to load the table up, turn the conveyor off, so all the bottles or cans are on the table, and then turn the shower up, and then slowly warm it up, from fill temperature at 32 up to 140 degrees, and then hold it at 140 for a prescribed amount of time, blah, 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 get your PU count, and then turn it off and let them cool off, and then turn the conveyor back on and pack them out, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to do. I figure I can get maybe 30 cases onto that table. Maybe.
Yeah.
So that's
that was, if you haven't,
see if we can make happen.
Sure. It is interesting. Again, if you haven't seen that video, that warming table, you will see me be authentically excited about in that video, because it's something that a lot of folks don't have, especially people coming from smaller breweries. So very cool piece of equipment, and it would give you an idea of what we're talking about in this segment. So I know there's been some different, trainings, warnings coming out from Brewers Association. I've even heard some conversation knocking around recently about NA beer on draft. I've heard some people saying that putting NA beer on draft is a bad idea. What's your take on that?
Well, I would agree. It's a Pandora's box, right? You might do it and nothing happens, and that's fine. You might do it and you might kill somebody.
Is that it?
I mean, that's the thing about the industry that we're in, right? I mean, in fairness, because we're making beer, because it has alcohol in it, because it has hops in it, beer is shelf stable, and you'll hear people say this all the time: there are no known pathogens that grow in beer due to those two compounds, right? And as far as I'm aware, that is true. But you've taken the alcohol out. When you take the alcohol out, now there are known pathogens. There are known pathogens that grow in this stuff, right? It's a different game, right? And so as brewers, as a culture, we're kind of used to being like, hey, let's throw this shit against the wall and see what sticks. Right. I mean, that is the way this whole industry has operated pretty much since it was founded in 1985. Right. Or so thereabouts. So we have this mentality. People will be willing to do that and like, hey, whatever. I don't know that that's wise. Right. Because all it's going to take is somebody to get significantly ill or die. And every regulatory body on the planet is going to be up all of our collective asses, right? I mean, this is the way it's going to go. So the reason that draft is a problem potentially is because you can't pasteurize it in the container, in the keg, right? You could flash pasteurize it on the way to the keg, right? And if you've got an automated keg filler, then it should either be getting steam pasteurized. The keg filler should be getting steam sanitized, right? Or it's washing at a hot enough temperature that it more or less does the same thing, right? Now, if you're manually washing your kegs, you don't get either of those, right? And so beer stone is, notorious for forming in kegs and notorious for harboring microflora. So the keg itself is a potential inoculation point because you can't pasteurize it, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing is what's in the tap line. Now, we have a regular schedule. We wash our tap lines every other week, which I think is pretty standard. Some people maybe do it every week. If you're in Germany, they do it every week.
Okay.
But, that doesn't mean there's nothing growing in there. And of course, you go out to some of these mom and pop bars and they may never have washed their tap lines. Right. And it's like, I wouldn't trust putting any keg on that tap line and being sure that nothing is drawing back out of the tap line into the keg. Right. Now, the day that you tap it, it's probably fine. How long does it take you to sell the keg? Right. Does that take a week? Does it take a month? Sell it in 2 days? If you're selling it in 2 days, maybe you're okay. I don't know. Right. So like we've talked about it here, doing it in our tap rooms, and I don't know that we've come to a conclusion. I'm advising us to not do that, but we'll see. But in our tap rooms, with the exception of one, we have 4 tap rooms. 3 of them we have a direct draw system in. The only one we don't is that one in Mason. It has a long draw system, so that's a different problem. But in a direct draw system, I can go in, I can change out the whole tap line, put a brand new tap line in. And it's like, okay, hey, we're putting NA beer on this. And we know, like I told my partners, like we got to buy brand new kegs, a set of a float of kegs that have never been used for anything else for NA, right? And then we put new tap lines in. And that's what you want to do. Then we could probably come up with an SOP for how we serve non-alcoholic beer in our own places, right? But outside of that, it's like I don't know that I would risk it, right? Because you really, and even I think at the very least, if you're going to do it, you need to think about how you're going to stabilize the beer. If you're going to use a chemical stabilizer, or if you're going to pasteurize it, I think you need to do something, right? Otherwise, you're running a huge risk, right? Because I mean, look, we've all screwed up a batch of beer. Everybody, any brewer that tells you they haven't ever done that is lying to you.
Right.
Now, the difference now is that if you screw up a batch of beer, you could end up in prison. Because you killed somebody, right? I mean, there's some very significant consequences here, not just to the person that drinks the NA beer, but to you as the manufacturer. You gotta kind of weigh all that out. Is it worth it, right?
Sure. So no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, listen, we're gonna wrap up here real quick, John. How can people follow what is going on with you and the brewery?
Well, with the brewery, we got Twitter, we got Instagram, we got all the social media stuff. Don't ask me how to get to any of it because, like I said, I'm a Gen X guy and I barely know how to use my phone.
Well, in all fairness, until I started to do this, I had to learn how to do Instagram in order to start doing this. So I had to learn a whole lot of stuff. So yeah, I feel your pain. So yeah.
But I think if you go to our website, www.warpedwing.com,
Yep.
you'll find the links to all that stuff, right?
Yeah. Yep.
To follow me personally, show up at the tap room on Friday at 4:00 and ask me what I'm doing.
Love it.
Because I am not on social media, man. I don't.
Good for you, dude. Good for you. I try to myself because the social media kind of is the base of what I'm doing with this stuff. So I at least try to make it a one-way vessel, like where I put things out and I try to consume very little, but sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. But John, I got to tell you, I do. Please hold on the call just for a moment after we jump off stream. But again, a big thanks to John Haggerty. If you get into Dayton or some of the other locations, make sure if you're in those areas, make sure to stop by, grab some food, grab some beers. Next week, I will be back with Amy Mast of Craft Leadership. One of the things that we like to do on this channel, we like to talk about how we can be building this career. A lot of times folks can have jobs in this field. I'm very passionate about trying to help people have a career in this field. And so Craft Leadership is a group that does leadership training specifically for craft breweries. I saw a talk that Amy did a couple of years ago. And I'll be honest, I was not expecting to learn much from it. You can judge that however you want, however full of myself I am. But usually when I see stuff like that, I don't know. It tends to be platitudes, but there are some really good practical stuff. And so I saw her at OCBA, and we had a great conversation at one of the events, and we started talking about communication. And so we're going to focus on communication in next week's. I know it's not going to be specific beer stuff, but I think there's going to be some really solid takeaways for all of you. So keep an eye out for that. And beyond that, work hard, be good to your people, and we'll catch up with you next time. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, Adam.
Absolutely. Thank you, man.